Hello and welcome to Ex-Cult Ed, the podcast where I share my experiences, thoughts and feelings after leaving the truth, otherwise known as the 2x2 way, the fellowship, the one true way. You get the picture. My hope is that in sharing this it will be cathartic for me and perhaps make you, dear listener, feel less alone if you've been through or are going through something similar. This is my story. Growing up in the cult, the names William Irvine and Edward Cooney were familiar to me, but they were names I had learned to distance myself from and scoff at whenever they came up. In fact, I had questioned it a few times to preachers and friends, asking them if they'd heard of William Irvine and what relevance he had to the way, and I was always shut down. Anyone who did speak of Cooney made it sound like he was a crazy person, and I was told that the story of the way starting with William Irvine was just a lie made up by worldly people to make us doubt. It actually blows my mind that this religion I grew up thinking had been in existence for years wasn't even 100 years old when I first joined. We're talking 2 to 3 generations old, and its history was a complete lie that we all believed. But we were brought up to think that lying was a complete and utter sin. It's very likely that I personally met people who knew the true history of the cult, and here I was thinking it was based on honesty and good morals. But the whole foundation of what I came to know as the truth was a lie. In the book The Secret Sect by Doug and Helen Parker, they refer to the cult as a sect. However, I'm going to refer to it as a cult in this podcast, but I should say that they don't use that term in their book. I remember when I did a trip to Sri Lanka in 2016, the 2 brother workers there were lovely people, but one of them was talking about a book that was being sent to a lot of the friends there. He said they were having troubles with it and were advising the friends to destroy it and not read it. I'm wondering now what the book was, and whether it was this book. Anyway, I'm going to dive into the history of the cult that I learnt while reading this book. Please forgive me if I get any details wrong. I definitely think the book itself is worth a read. However, it's very hard to come by considering that it's out of print and secondhand copies are hard to find and also very expensive. So here goes. It all started in Scotland in 1863 when a man called William Irvine was born. He joined something called the Faith Mission in 1895, which was founded to convert villages in rural Scotland and Ireland. The system of the Faith Mission was similar to the cult that we know now, where preachers travelled 2 by 2 and held meetings. Irvine participated in this and left each village with a prayer union group that had a prayer union representative, which sounds very much like our Sunday morning meetings with elders held in the homes today. In 1896, William Irvine went to Ireland and preached there, but he lost his faith in the Faith Mission because he didn't like churches and because the people he converted drifted away. He wanted to see strong commitment and effort. William Irvine was then with a companion called John Long and was reading Matthew chapter 10, where it speaks of Jesus sending out the apostles with no belongings or money or extra clothes. He asked his preaching companion, "When did God change this? Does he mean it to be the same today?" And his companion replied, "I suppose it has never changed." Irvine felt like this was a revelation for him because he disliked the ministers being paid salaries and having homes and church buildings. So William Irvine and John Long went out to convert people to this new way of serving God. Some of the first people who started preaching Irvine's message were May Carroll, who was a preacher with the Faith Mission, and her brothers Jack and Bill Carroll, who were Irish farmers. Irvine told his followers to go out without working or relying on any person or business to meet their daily needs. They were to get rid of all their possessions and only have the clothes they were wearing. On top of this, anything that they did own, such as their clothes, bicycles, and camping gear, had to be of poor quality. This was called living by faith. Because Irvine was still working under the Faith Mission, he used their funds and resources for some years between 1897 and 1900 while building his own followers. In 1899, Irvine led a bicycle tour of Scotland and converted some Faith Mission members to his cause. In 1901, he officially left the Faith Mission and was followed by a few preachers who he converted, including a Scottish man called John Hardy and members of the Irish Carroll family. And now enter Edward Cooney, a name that would also be familiar to anyone who knows of the cult. Edward Cooney viewed Irvine as a prophet of God and gave up his business, donated £1,300 and became a preacher. Other preachers also did the same. In fact, this whole movement was described as an experiment in Christian communism. The thing is, a lot of these young people didn't really know the Bible. They just blindly followed what Irvine said, because it seems he was quite a charismatic person. Young people started to cut off their parents and families if they didn't support their decision to become homeless preachers, even going as far as to condemn them to hell. One of the early conventions was held in 1903 at a farm in Ireland and went for 3 weeks. The new converts gave everything to Irvine's way and broke family and social ties in what is described in the book as desocialization. At this convention, Irvine told them the strict rules they needed to live by, and at the end of the convention, everyone took a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. At this stage, because of the value placed on celibacy, men and women sat separately in the convention tent. However, Irvine himself apparently had a child born out of marriage, so the very founder of this cult wasn't even living the life he forced many others into. After this convention, preachers went to the USA, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Germany, China, South America, and other countries to spread this message and get more converts. They started organizing conventions to get more preachers and convert people more deeply. By 1907, there were more than 600 people at one convention in Ireland, where they practiced baptism in the way the cult does now. For anyone unfamiliar, we were baptized as adults by being fully dunked in water. In my case, it was a dam, where I was led fully clothed in a skirt pinned between my legs, of course, so it wouldn't float up and be immodest. I walked out to a male preacher, turned and faced the crowd of people standing around the top of the dam, crossed my arms over my chest, and was dunked backwards by the male preacher. I then walked out looking like a drowned rat while the crowd sang hymns. Back in those days, though, the public saw these baptisms and mocked the converts and wanted to drive them out. So police had to attend to make sure everyone was safe. Nowadays, the baptisms are so quiet that no worldly person would have any idea they were happening. Something that interested me was that the early preachers were told that learning and education could be a hindrance to the truth, a view that I feel still pervades the cult today. I personally was told by the preachers not to study philosophy and psychology in school because it was unnecessary and dangerous and airy-fairy stuff. They then established what was known as the living witness doctrine. The idea came about that only those who were converted by Irvine or his preachers could be saved. This is a view that still holds strongly in the cult today, that nobody can be saved unless they hear the gospel specifically through the cult's preachers. However, some of the members, including Edward Cooney, disagreed with the living witness doctrine. But it was an important part in making the preachers feel a high level of authority. Basically, the belief is that if you don't hear the gospel through one of the ordained preachers, you have no possibility of spiritual life with God in heaven. Here's where it gets quite interesting. When the religion moved overseas to the USA and Australia, new converts weren't told that it was only a recent development. In fact, they were told that they were in fellowship with the oldest church. People could tell that Irvine was a powerful member of the cult when they met him, but they were just told that he was one of the preachers. Hardly anyone heard that he was the founder of the cult. This made it so much easier for the lie to be built on in future years. In 1908, Irvine officially divided membership into saints and workers and set up house meetings to keep people committed, with an emphasis on those meetings being kept small, as they still are today. The meetings in the cult are held on Sunday mornings and Wednesday evenings in the lounge room of members' homes with around 20 people present. The early preachers had a really hard time. A quote in the book from a preacher said, "You just went with what you had. No money, no clothes were carried, you slept in a barn or stayed with people. You were truly a tramp preacher." Preachers were to dress modestly and protest against current fashions in society, which is also something that still happens today. In fact, I remember being at a convention one year and seeing a female preacher wearing a skirt that I had bought myself, and I was so embarrassed to be seen in the same skirt. The book speaks of Irvine saying that female preachers got 8 shillings a week, which workers knew was a lie, but nobody said anything because if Irvine hadn't told that lie, female preachers would have been banned. People looked at Matthew 10 to see where it said preachers could be female, but Irvine handed around notes saying that if somebody went to the Bible to prove that women shouldn't preach, they were a fool. As those of us who were in the cult would know, we had no name that we knew of. I remember people asking what it was called, and I would reply, it's non-denominational and has no name, because Jesus had no name, which was ridiculous in hindsight because he did have a name, Jesus Christ. Anyway, in France they called it, and please forgive my pronunciation, Les Anonymous, and in German, Die Namenlosen, the nameless ones. We used to call it the truth all the way, or sometimes refer to it as the gospel. Back then, they also met regularly on Wednesdays and Sundays in homes, and the whole thing was kept quite secret from the public. If anyone asked questions, they would be met with mysterious and vague answers, which really hasn't changed much today. Names that were big in the cult back then, apart from William Irvine, were Irvine Weir, Jack Carroll, George Walker, and George Beatty, who went to America, as well as John Hardy, William Carroll, Adam Hutchinson, and Tom Turner, who went to Australia. Preachers used bicycles to get around because they had no financial support, and they lived in sheds, old rental houses, or halls. I found the section about the early preachers in Australia very interesting and also quite sad. The book describes how the men and women had to cycle long distances across the Australian landscape, and without any extra clothes or money to buy food. They were so poor that they had to get their water from creeks and sew patches on their pants whenever they wore through from all the cycling. When it was rainy weather, they just had to stay wet because they didn't have anything to change into. Some of them even died because of the conditions. One died of pneumonia. The book writes of preachers making apple jam from apples they found on the side of the road and some sugar because they couldn't afford any other food. When some preachers tried working to earn money to survive, they were told by the senior workers they weren't allowed to do that. Another really scary story from the book was when two preachers had to stay in a place covered with mosquitoes and fleas on the floor. They couldn't afford money to fix a damaged tooth, so one of them got an abscess. And in that condition, they had a journey of around 330 kilometers ahead of them. During the cycling, one of the preachers got a leg injury and had 8 operations on his leg, which he couldn't afford to pay for. The senior preachers denied there being a central bank account, but one member said they saw an overseer at a bank with a checkbook. A preacher named Arthur McCoy also found out that there was a trust account held at a bank in his name that he had no knowledge of and no access to when he was needing medical attention. They found out that in each state the overseer kept a bank account with convention funds and other gifts. The book also writes of another woman who gave a lot of money to preachers before she herself went into the work, and then she had no money to buy anything to meet her needs. When her mental health subsequently went downhill, she had to go and rest with worldly relatives. It just feels so awful and uncomfortable for me to read these stories because I was raised to believe that I was following in God's way, which was the safe place, and everyone there was kind. But these are examples of where the kindness is so conditional that it quickly turns into cruelty when someone's views differ from that of the cult. And then comes the really, really interesting bit. The cult disowned its own founder. Once overseers were appointed, and for anyone who doesn't know, these were senior preachers who directed all the other preachers in their area on where to go. Preachers lost all their freedom. Initially, preachers had just gone wherever they felt moved to go. But Irvine and the overseers made them hand over any money they'd been donated and told them exactly where to go and preach. Young workers were forced to travel on bicycles with no comforts at all, while senior workers had access to other modes of transport. I actually didn't think about the severe restriction placed on people who became preachers and how they are really living their lives at the whim of the overseer and whoever they get put with. In fact, I was recently speaking with the parents of a preacher who was sent to a different state, and I asked if they at least see their son at Christmas time, but they said he isn't allowed to leave the state, so they have to be happy with phone calls. Then the power went to Irvine's head, and he started saying he was an anointed witness of God, alongside John from the Bible, and that he would have the power of drought and plagues. He spoke about stars being other worlds, and that the members of his movement were the 144,000 talked about in Revelation. Senior preachers such as John Hardy stopped William Irvine from speaking at conventions in their state, so many members stopped hearing from him and had no idea that there was a private battle going on. As many of us know, covering things up is second nature to the cult. This was all happening in 1913 onwards, when leading preachers including Jack Carroll and Edward Cooney decided they were no longer loyal to William Irvine. They figured that William Irvine was once led by God, so the way he founded was the correct one, but he had now lost the Spirit of God, so he was to be banished and not recognised as the leader anymore. William Carroll, who was the overseer in Victoria in Australia, told Irvine about this decision in 1914. Overseers started saying the cult had no founder on earth, instead of acknowledging that their founder had started to have crazy ideas. So the cult was divided, with some being loyal to Irvine and others being loyal to their overseers. William Irvine had prophesied that members should sell their homes and invest in other things because a drought was coming in August 1914. And some followers actually did so, which resulted in Irvine burying thousands of dollars worth of food in the US before going to Jerusalem to wait for the prophecy to play out. The founder of the cult lived in Jerusalem using money sent to him from his supporters for the next 33 years until he died in 1947 from throat cancer. This baffles me because my grandparents were alive at the same time as the founder of the cult, the founder who I never heard about. In the years after 1914, overseers actually banned anyone who supported Irvine from attending fellowship meetings, and even went as far as to excommunicate anyone who refused to ignore his part in the history of the cult. Preachers and friends were suddenly excluded from the homes and fellowship with people they'd been close to for years. Young preachers were told not to talk about Irvine at all, and preachers started to say that the church was from the beginning. The book tells the sad story of a preacher based in South Africa named Joe Kerr, who said he had seen the marks of Jesus in people outside the religion. He then had members of the cult go and take away everything they'd lent him, including his bed. The result of his excommunication was him starving and going blind, because he had no trade to fall back on. Then came the banishment of another really important name in the history of the cult, Edward Cooney. Cooney was bothered by the direction the movement was taking, especially the differences between normal members and workers. He didn't like that workers couldn't preach wherever they felt moved to go anymore, as well as there being more money and more control involved under the overseers who were lying about the history of the cult. He kept preaching that preachers should be poor and not have a hierarchy, and some preachers agreed with him. However, it seems the power also went to Cooney's head and he felt morally superior. He then tried to heal a sick young person, which clearly didn't work, and so let her think she had failed in her faith. This resulted in him being banned from the cult, and those loyal to him started meetings of their own, which explains why I'd heard of the Cooneyites being a separate religion to ours. I remember asking about the Cooneyites, and I was told snippets about them and how they were similar, but I wasn't told anything about their link to the cult. In fact, anyone who talked to me about them made them out to be dangerous and crazy people that I should stay away from. Then followed lots of arguing within the cult between overseers in different countries, and members had to choose who they were loyal to. Preachers started watching members more and used the small fellowship meetings to help with the restriction and conformity demanded of them. Members were excommunicated simply for associating with preachers who had displeased their overseers. Fear was used as a way to make members submit and repress the true history of the cult. The cult didn't just practice excommunication. They practiced excommunication of those who refused to excommunicate the excommunicated. A quote from the book reads, "It became clear the friends had learned to uphold the workers without question, but had learned nothing of upholding the gospel of the grace of God." New preachers continued to give all their money to the overseers, and when they got sick or had personal needs, they didn't get given any money or support. But still, for some reason, the whole thing kept growing, and by 1942, there were 110 Australian preachers alone. I find it so hard to come to terms with the fact that I was lied to about the whole truth of how the cult was founded, and that it was actually founded only recently. Like, we're talking 124 years between now and the very first mission led by William Irvine in Ireland in 1899. That means that within about 3 generations, the truth was completely and deliberately hidden, to the point where my generation would hear whiffs of it and vigorously deny it. Most of us are 2nd or 3rd generation members, so there is a high chance that we were lied to by somebody we met. There's a really big chance that our grandparents or uncles or aunts or even senior preachers we met knew the truth about the truth and hid it from us, whether maliciously or out of fear of being cast out from the only way of life and family that they knew. I can't believe that I once fully believed this lie. It is just insane to me that this cult that said it started with Jesus and had a goal to have no hierarchy and send preachers out the way Jesus did in Matthew 10, ended up with a hierarchy and showing no compassion at all to those who founded it. In fact, the lack of compassion of cult members that I read about in this book, willing to abandon someone and let them starve, is the exact opposite of everything I thought the cult was when I was in it. I thought it was caring, kind, warm. But I realize now that all of that came at a cost. Blind obedience. From my experience, as soon as you start doubting, the kindness and warmth diminishes and turns into warnings and passive aggression. People say lines such as, "Consider your salvation with fear and trembling," whatever that means. Personally, I experienced a huge lack of compassion from members of the cult when Mum was sick. My mum was a single mum, and I was a teenager at the time. My father, who was divorced from my mother, moved back in and restricted access to anyone who didn't support him, which basically meant anyone who supported Mum and I. The people who helped me and brought me food were my school friends. The people who asked if I was okay were my school friends and teachers. I experienced far more humanity from those outside the cult than anyone inside it. In fact, I even heard that some in the cult were saying it was my fault that Mum got cancer. So reading about this harsh and un-Christ-like treatment by members of those who refuse to conform really hits close to home for me. In fact, I even saw a partial divide between the preachers. There were those who supported Mum and I, and there were those who supported the lies that my father made up. One of the fundamental beliefs the cult was founded on was the living witness doctrine, which extended on Jesus saying, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." The workers then became like mini Jesuses because they were the only living connection to God in our eyes. I remember thinking about the fact that we were told and believed that we were the only way that came directly from Jesus, and that people could only come to God through hearing the gospel from our preachers. I remember wondering how that worked, since God was supposed to give every person in the world a chance. How could every person in the world hear this word from these preachers when there were so few of them and we were so hidden? I remember feeling a lot of pressure because my interactions with any worldly person could be their only chance to find God's way and therefore be saved like we were. And so often my words and feelings about the cult were carefully spoken so I didn't turn anyone away from it and ruin their chances of going to heaven. Another quote from the book I'd like to share is, one who observed members over some years commented that, in the matter of Bible study, members were concerned chiefly with searching out support for their position. In fact, returning to meetings after 10 years or so, one could hear exactly the same comments being made. End quote. I suppose we all just made up something and shared it, and regurgitated things that preachers had said in a bid to be accepted and acceptable to this group that we were so desperately clinging to. Now that I've been out of the cult for a few years, it is starting to become unfathomable to me that this thing still exists, where young people give everything they own, including property, to overseers and choose to be celibate and go and preach what they believe is God's word. I do remember feeling the guilt and responsibility of what was known as the call to the work as a young person, because of the belief that if none were called, the world would have no chance to get to know God. The preachers still have no belongings except a little suitcase and move between the homes of the members, but at least they get fed well. They get fed like kings and queens, in fact. Preachers with dietary conditions just have to send a list ahead and the friends will buy them whatever they need, even if it's more expensive than what they can afford. Having the preachers come to stay in your home is like having royalty. You pull out all the stops, which looks like your fancy dinner set that sits in the glory box for the rest of the year, the best quality food you can muster, a quiet home where the kids are on their best behavior, and everybody ready to attend to whatever needs the preachers might have. The power of the overseers was an interesting thing for me to read about because it explains how and why the rules seem to differ from state to state and country to country. I remember that members who divorced and remarried weren't allowed to speak in fellowship meetings in my state. But then I heard that this was completely okay and allowed in other areas. In fact, even in Australia, the strictness or rigidness of the Friends differed from state to state. For example, I found Victoria to be far more strict on rules and dress codes than South Australia or Queensland. I'm sharing what I learnt from the book because knowing this many years ago would have been extremely helpful for me. And I have to say a huge thank you to the person who lent me this book. And I also have to say a huge thank you to the community of people who have now left the cult and are being a huge support to each other and myself. Being part of this amazing and strong group of people has helped tremendously in facing my own trauma and my own healing journey. And reading this book has been incredible. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I really appreciate you. If you'd like to reach out, ask any questions, vent, say whatever you need to say, even if that's getting annoyed about something I've said, email me at exculted@gmail.com. That's exculted@gmail.com. And always remember, you can walk your own way, speak your own truth, and live your own life. Bye!